Ah, yes, the typical rainy day we all experienced growing up. Laughing, hanging out, and having fun. But what if we weren't so lucky? What if instead of playing, we carried the burden of providing for our families? Let's go back in time to explore an era where childhood wasn't about laughter, but labor. Factories instead of playgrounds, machines instead of toys, and danger instead of safety. This was the reality for thousands of children during the Industrial Revolution and beyond. In the late 19th century, childhood was a privilege few could afford. As America's factories grew, so did the demand for cheap, obedient workers. The solution? Children. Small hands, long hours, and no protections. Their right to grow up, overshadowed by the responsibility to provide. With rapid urbanization came a hunger for progress. But at what cost? Factories flourished, fueled by endless streams of immigrant families searching for opportunity. But for many, opportunity meant sacrifice. Child labor in America was not a new concept. In the 1830s, young girls powered the textile industry in places like Lowell, Massachusetts. For many, working was seen as a rite of passage, a way to contribute to their families and learn discipline. It was not an exploitation, but an expectation. They worked in textile mills, glass factories, coal mines, and fields. They sorted tobacco, carried heavy loads, and operated dangerous machinery, all for a fraction of an adult's wage. Their small hands could reach into places that others couldn't, making them ideal for work that no one else wanted. But factories weren't designed for children. They were designed for profit, and profit had little room for safety. Exhaustion was constant. 12, 14, and sometimes even 16-hour shifts with no breaks. Little food, no protection, and no second chances. A moment of fatigue, a single misstep, equals crushed hands, severed limbs, and even death. In coal mines, breaker boys inhaled toxic dust that destroyed their lungs before they reached adulthood. In mills, children were scalped with their hair cut in spinning machines. Their bodies were treated as disposable. One child lost meant another takes their place. A few voices, like that of photographer Lewis Hine, began to capture these horrors. His photographs exposed the unseen. Children robbed of their childhood. Their faces weary beyond their years. But for most, there was no escape. The factory floor was the reality, and survival meant silence. Journalists reported how dangerous work was to children. Mine workers under age 16 were 3 times more likely to die than were adults. And 75% of the coal sorters who were killed were children under 16, said Jeff Nelson with the Saturday Evening Post. For countless children, the factory floor replaced the classroom. Without education, they were doomed to a future as bleak as their past, trapped in a cycle of poverty from which escape was nearly impossible. These children, often the sons and daughters of immigrant families, work long hours for meager wages. Their dreams of a better future crushed beneath the weight of industry. Beyond their lack of education, children working faced an even greater threat: exposure to crime, dangerous living conditions, and moral corruption in the urban centers. Forced to grow up too soon, many found themselves in environments where exploitation, abuse, and vice were all commonplace. Their lives were not their own, they belonged to machines and to the streets. On March 25th, 1911, the world witnessed one of the most horrific industrial disasters in American history: the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire. Locked exits, flammable materials, and a disregard for safety turned the factory into a death trap. 146 workers perished, most of them young immigrant girls, some as young as 14. Trapped by greed and negligence, they leapt to their deaths rather than be consumed by the flames. Their deaths sparked outrage. No longer could the nation ignore the brutal reality of factory work. Public awareness surged, and the labor movement gained unprecedented momentum. Labor unions and activists seized the moment, Strikes erupted, demanding better wages, shorter hours, and safer conditions, not just for adults, but for children as well. Factory owners fought back, arguing that regulation would cripple the economy and drive up consumer prices. But the tide was turning. The fight for child labor laws was long and hard fought. In 1916, Congress passed the Keating-Owen Act, prohibiting the sales of goods made by children under 14. It was a landmark victory, but short-lived. The Supreme Court struck it down, declaring it unconstitutional. The battle was far from over. The Great Depression exposed the deep flaws in America's labor system. As unemployment soared, the call to end child labor gained momentum. No longer could the nation justify forcing children to toil in dangerous conditions while millions of adults struggled to find work. In 1938, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed the Fair Labor Standards Act, a landmark law that set minimum working ages, restricted hazardous jobs for minors, and established a 40-hour work week. It was a monumental step in ending child exploitation in American industry. But while the Fair Labor Standards Act provided new protections, it did not eliminate child labor entirely. Exceptions were carved out for agriculture and family-run businesses, loopholes that still exist today. In states like Arkansas, recent legislative changes have weakened child labor protections, allowing children as young as 14 to work longer hours without parental consent. This is present not only in the United States, but also across the globe, as millions of children still toil in sweatshops, mines, and fields, deprived of education and safety. The echoes of the past remain, proving that the fight against child labor is far from over. Today, over 160 million children worldwide remain trapped in labor. The same economic pressures that had justified child labor in the past continue to drive exploitation today. The choice between survival and education remains an impossible dilemma for many families. The question remains, who is responsible for protecting children? Governments? Businesses? Consumers? The past has shown that change only comes when people demand it. Just as Lewis Hind's photographs exposed the horrors of child labor a century ago, today's activists continue to fight for the rights of children. The horrors of child labor during the Progressive Era awakened a movement, one that reshaped laws, redefined childhood, and reinforced the belief that every child deserves the right to grow, learn, and thrive. From the textile mills of Lowell to the coal mines of Pennsylvania, from the garment factories of New York to the fields of Arkansas, the fight against child labor has been long and hard fought. Activists, unions, and reformers refuse to stay silent, and their efforts forever change the landscape of American labor laws. Yet, as history has shown, progress is not guaranteed. Today, as laws are weakened and industries seek cheaper labor, we find ourselves facing familiar battles. The same economic pressures that once justified child labor continue to threaten the rights of children. Lewis Hind once said, "There are two things I wanted to do. I wanted to show the things that had to be corrected, and I wanted to show the things that had to be appreciated." His photographs served as a call to action, a call that still echoes today. The right to grow up should never be a privilege. It should be a promise that no child will ever have to choose between their future and their survival. A promise that the mistakes of the past will not be repeated, and a promise that the fight for justice does not end. It continues, with each new generation carrying the torch forward.